The wind came hard across the open fields that morning, pulling dust off the furrows and scattering it like ghosts across the highway, and Garrett Holland stood in the barn doorway with his father's lasso folded in his coat pocket, staring at the two tractors sitting silent in the shadows, a green John Deere Model 4020 and a faded blue Ford 5000, both looking like they'd been rode hard and put away wet for the last time. His father, Raymond Hollins, had been dead 3 weeks now, heart attack in the south pasture during wheat harvest, and the funeral had been small, attended mostly by men in worn Carhartt jackets who didn't say much but gripped Garrett's hand like they were holding on to something that was slipping away. Garrett had come back to Mineral County, Kansas, after 15 years working construction in Wichita, left home angry at 18 over some argument he could barely remember now, and standing here in the February cold of 1970, looking at those two tractors his father had somehow kept running all these years, he felt like he'd been handed a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The farm was 712 acres, according to the county records the lawyer had shown him, spread across 3 separate parcels that didn't quite connect, linked by gravel roads and barbed wire and handshake agreements that went back to his grandfather's time. Garrett had expected maybe 100 acres, enough to sell off and settle the estate, maybe keep a little chunk for memory's sake. But 700 acres was a real operation, a working farm that should have had 3 or 4 decent tractors, a combine, multiple trucks, hired hands during harvest, a whole infrastructure of equipment and maintenance. Instead, what his father had left him was 2 tractors that had to be 20 years old if they were a day, a barn full of hand tools and spare parts organized with the kind of precision you only see in men who can't afford to lose anything, and a checking account at Mineral County Bank with $47.16 in it. The house was paid off. That was something. A small 2-story farmhouse with white paint peeling off the clapboard and a porch that sagged on one corner. But 700 acres of Kansas farmland with nothing but 2 old tractors. To work it felt like inheriting an ocean with a bucket for a boat. He walked over to the John Deere first, ran his hand along the hood, felt the cold metal under his palm. The paint was faded, but the machine was clean, not a speck of mud or grease where there shouldn't be. And when he climbed up into the seat, the vinyl was cracked but not torn, patched in places with duct tape that had been applied carefully, smoothed down like it mattered. The Ford sat 10 feet away, smaller, older, the blue paint almost gray in spots, but equally maintained, equally cared for with that same quiet obsession. Garrett tried to start the John Deere, turned the key, heard the engine cough once and then catch, settling into a rough idle that smoothed out after a few seconds, and he sat there with his hands on the wheel, listening to it run, trying to understand what his father had been doing out here for 15 years with equipment that should have been replaced a decade ago. Now I want to hear from you folks right now. Have you ever inherited something that made absolutely no sense until you dug deeper, until you started seeing the whole picture your father or grandfather had been working on without telling anybody? Drop a comment below, because this story gets stranger the more Garrett started looking around that farm. The neighbors started coming by the second week, not to pay respects exactly. That time had passed, but to circle around the topic of the land with the careful politeness men use when they're talking about money, without saying the word. Ed Prosser came first, drove up in a new Ford F-250, fire engine red, walked into the yard like he owned it, and offered Garrett $12,000 for the north 80 acres, the section that bordered Prosser's own spread. Prime land. Your daddy knew it, I know it, and you probably know it too, but you're not going to farm it with them antiques in the barn. So let's talk sense. Garrett told him he wasn't ready to sell anything yet. Needed to figure out what he had first, and Prosser's face went tight around the mouth, the way men's faces do when they're used to getting what they want and someone just said no. Your daddy was stubborn too, Prosser said, climbing back his truck. Didn't do it much good in the end, did it? Then came Vernon Lassiter, county commissioner's brother, made the same pitch for a different section, offered $10,000 cash, said he'd have the paperwork drawn up by end of week if Garrett wanted to be smart about things. After that came Dale Kruger, who farmed the section west of the Hollins place, came by with a bottle of whiskey and a story about how Raymond had always promised him first option on any land that came available, though Garrett noticed Dale couldn't quite look him in the eye when he said it. Inside a week and a half, for different men had made offers on pieces of the farm, not the whole thing, just specific parcels, like they'd already carved it up in their heads, and were just waiting for Raymond to die so they could come collect. Garrett turned them all down, partly because something about the whole thing felt wrong, partly because he kept thinking about those 2 tractors sitting in the barn, maintained with a level of care that suggested his father had been planning something, working toward something, even if Garrett couldn't see what was yet. He started going through his father's papers at night, sitting at the kitchen table under a single yellow bulb, sorting through receipts and bank statements and handwritten notes in his father's cramped, careful handwriting. The farm had been mortgaged twice in the last 10 years, both times paid off within 18 months, and the dates corresponded with land purchases, small parcels bought from neighbors who were selling out or retiring, adding to the original homestead 40 acres at a time. His father had been assembling something, piecing together a larger operation from fragments, but doing it so slowly and so quietly that nobody had noticed until now. The equipment purchases were minimal, just maintenance parts and occasional used tools, nothing new, nothing expensive. But the seed purchases were substantial, hybrid wheat and Milo varieties, the good stuff that cost money up front but yielded more per acre if you knew what you were doing. His father had been farming on a shoestring, squeezing every dollar, avoiding debt like it was poison, building something that looked small from the outside, but was actually sprawling and complex underneath. There was a ledger, green canvas cover, filled with his father's handwriting, yield numbers going back 8 years, crop rotations, soil test results, rainfall measurements, profit margins calculated to the penny. The numbers were good, better than good. They were exceptional for a small operation, and Garrett realized his father had been running 700 acres as efficiently as farms 3 times that size, doing it with 2 tractors and his own labor and a level of precision that most commercial operations couldn't match even with all their modern equipment. The secret was in the rotation, the way Raymond had divided the parcels, planting wheat on 200 acres while another 200 grew Milo. Another section sat fallow with cover crops to rebuild the soil, everything timed and planned. So the workload spread across the seasons, and 2 tractors could handle what would normally require a fleet. It was brilliant, actually, if you understood what you were looking at, a kind of agricultural choreography that required perfect timing and perfect maintenance and perfect knowledge of every acre, every soil type, every microclimate across 3 separate parcels. But here's what Garrett couldn't figure out: why his father had done alone, why he'd never hired help, never bought newer equipment, never talked to anyone about what he was building out here. The farm was profitable. The ledger proved it. Not rich, but solid, sustainable, the kind of operation that should have been the pride of Mineral County. But Raymond Hollins had run it like a secret, like something he was hiding from the world. And now Garrett was standing in the middle of it, trying to understand not just the how, but the why. He drove into town on a Saturday, needed supplies, and wanted to talk to people, see what folks remembered about his father, what stories they told. Mineral Springs, Kansas, was one of those high plains towns that had peaked in the 1950s and been declining slowly ever since. Grain elevator at one end, 2-block downtown with a hardware store, a diner, a bank, a feed store, most of the shops on Main Street empty or converted into storage. The diner was called Betty's, red vinyl booths and a counter with chrome stools, smelled like coffee and bacon grease. And when Garrett walked in, the conversation didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, lowered, became more careful. He ordered coffee and eggs, sat at the counter, and listened to men in the back booth talking about wheat prices and whether the spring would be wet or dry. And after a while, Betty herself came over, short woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes, refilled his cup without asking. "You're Raymond's boy," she said. Statement, not question. "Sorry about your daddy. He was a good man, quiet but good." Garrett asked her what she remembered about his father, what kind of farmer he'd been, and Betty glanced back at the booth where 3 men were watching without appearing to watch. "Your daddy kept to himself," she said carefully. "Paid his bills, didn't know nobody, didn't ask for nothing. Worked that farm alone for years after you left, never complained, never caused trouble. Some folks thought he was strange, keeping to himself like that, but strange ain't the same as bad." She paused, wiping the counter with a rag. "There was talk, though, few years back, about your granddaddy and some business with the land, before your daddy took over. You might want to ask Harlan Gibbs about that. He's old enough to remember, lives out on County Road 8 past the old feed mill." Garrett finished his breakfast and drove out to find Harlan Gibbs, followed Betty's directions to a small house set back on the road, surrounded by junk cars and old farm equipment slowly rusting into the prairie. Harlan was maybe 80, wiry and bent, sitting on his porch in a canvas chair, and when Garrett introduced himself, the old man nodded like he'd been expecting this visit for years. "Wonder when somebody from your family would come asking questions," Harlan said. "Your granddaddy, Ezra Hollins, he owned 40 acres back in the 30s. Dust Bowl times, barely enough to keep a family fed, but he was smart and he was patient. Lots of men were selling out, giving up, heading to California or wherever they thought things were better, and Ezra started buying their land, penny on the dollar, sometimes just taking over the taxes and calling it square. By 1945, he had maybe 200 acres. By 1950, it was 300, and folks started noticing, started asking how a man who'd started with nothing was accumulating that much land." Harlan paused, pulled out a tobacco pouch, rolled a cigarette with shaking hands. "There was an accusation," he said, licking the paper. "Man named Dalton Kruger, Dale's uncle, claimed Ezra had cheated him somehow, said there was a parcel that Ezra didn't have clear title to, that it should have stayed in the Kruger family. Went to the county commissioners, made a big stink about it, wanted the land back or wanted compensation. Commissioners looked into it, couldn't find any evidence of wrongdoing, dismissed complaint, but the accusation stuck. You know how towns are. Ezra died in 1953, passed the farm to your daddy, and Raymond spent the next 17 years working that land like he had something to prove, like he was trying to earn back a reputation that had been questioned. That's why he kept it small, why he never talked about what he was doing, why he ran the whole operation like he was under investigation, keeping every receipt, every record, everything documented and clean. What would you do if you inherited not just land but a family grudge, a reputation you had to defend, without even knowing the full story? Let me know in the comments, because Garrett was about to find out that his father's silence had been protecting something bigger than just acres and equipment. Garrett went back to the farm and looked at the land with different eyes now, understanding that every acre represented a choice his grandfather made, a risk his father carried, a burden that had been passed down without explanation. The North 80 that Ed Prosser wanted, that had been part of the original Kruger claim, the parcel that caused all the trouble back in the 40s. And suddenly Prosser's eagerness to buy it made more sense, not because it was particularly better land, but because it carried history, carried proof of something. If Prosser bought it from Garrett, if it changed hands cleanly with witnesses and clear title, it would close the question of whether Ezra Hollins had stolen it or bought it fair, would settle the old grudge finally and completely. But his father hadn't sold it, had held on to it for 17 years, had held on to all of it, building the operation acre by acre, making it profitable and sustainable and undeniable, creating a farm that couldn't be questioned or dismissed or accused of being built on cheating or shortcuts. Raymond Hollins had spent nearly 2 decades proving something to a town that had forgotten the question, vindicating a father who'd been accused of dishonesty by running the most honest, most meticulous operation in the county. And he'd done it with 2 old tractors and his own labor, because every new purchase, every expansion, every modern convenience would have looked like extravagance, would have looked like he was flaunting wealth he didn't earn, would have reopened the wound his father's. Accusation had left. Garrett sat in the barn that night, engine hoist hanging from the rafters, work benches organized with tools arranged by size, spare parts labeled and stored in wooden crates built from scrap lumber, and he understood finally what he was looking at. This wasn't just a farm. It was a statement, a mathematical proof, a ledger that added up to innocence and hard work and legitimacy. And those 2 tractors sitting in the middle of it were the key to the whole thing, because they proved his father had done more with less than anyone else in the county, had outworked and outthought and outlasted every farmer with better equipment and easier circumstances, had built something undeniable with nothing but skill and stubbornness, and those 2, machines maintained with religious devotion. He started farming it himself, learned the rhythms his father had established, the rotation patterns, the timing of planting and harvest, the maintenance schedules that kept those tractors running season after season. The John Deere pulled the 6-bottom plow through the north section in March, preparing for spring wheat, and Garrett learned to read the soil through the way the tractor pulled, feeling through the wheel and the seat when he hit a hard patch or a soft spot, adjusting depth and speed by instinct the way his father must have done. The Ford handled the lighter work, disking and planting, pulling the grain drill through prepared fields with seeds rattling in the boxes behind him. And Garrett found himself falling into the same patterns his father had used, working sunrise to sunset, eating lunch in tractor seat, coming back to house after dark too tired to do anything but eat and sleep and go out again the next morning. The neighbors watched, some with curiosity, some with something closer to disappointment, because every day Garrett didn't sell was a day their plans stayed unfulfilled. Ed Prosser stopped by again in April, offered $15,000 this time for the North 80. Said it was his final offer, and Garrett was a fool if he didn't take it. But Garrett was starting to understand that the land wasn't really about money. Not anymore. It was about finishing what his father had started, proving what his grandfather had been accused of not proving. Clearing a family name that most people had forgotten was ever under suspicion. But then the drought hit, slow and mean, starting in May with 3 weeks of no rain. The wheat starting to curl and yellow before it should, and by June the whole county was talking about crop failures and federal assistance, and which farmers would make it through and which wouldn't. Garrett watched the sky every morning, checking for clouds that never came, and the wheat in the north section, the prime land that everyone wanted, started dying from the edges inward, the plants giving up acre by acre while the subsoil dried to powder. He irrigated what he could with the old equipment, running the floor with a pump pulling for the creek that cut through the southeast corner, dragging hoses across fields in the middle of the night when the evaporation was lowest. But 700 acres was too much to irrigate by hand, and the creek was dropping, exposing rocks and mud that should have been underwater. By July, he'd lost 100 acres of wheat, the plants dead and brown, not worth harvesting, and the milo in the west section was struggling, the stalks shorter than they should be, the heads small and sparse. His savings from Wichita were gone, spent on seed and fuel and parts, and the bank account his father had left was down to $11. And Garrett understood for the first time what his father must have felt all those years, working without margin for error, gambling every season that the weather would cooperate and the equipment would hold and his own body would keep functioning long enough to bring in the crop. He could sell now, call Ed Prosser or Vernon Lassiter, take their money and walk away, pay off any debts and start over somewhere else. But that would mean his father's work had been wasted, that the 17 years of proving and documenting and maintaining had added up to nothing but a farm that couldn't survive one bad season. What would you do at that moment? When selling out starts looking like the only sensible choice, but you know it means abandoning everything your father worked for. Leave a comment, because what happened next would test every assumption Garrett had about those two old tractors and the man who'd kept them running. The John Deere's transmission started slipping in mid-July. Hard shifts and grinding noises that meant something internal was wearing out, and Garrett knew from his father's maintenance records that the tractor was overdue for rebuild, something Raymond had been planning to do this winter, but hadn't lived long enough to complete. A transmission rebuild would cost $1,200 at the shop in town, or Garrett could do it himself if he had the time and the parts and a level of mechanical knowledge he wasn't sure he possessed. But either way, it meant the John Deere was going down during the critical weeks before harvest, leaving him with just a Ford to handle everything. And the Ford was smaller, older, less powerful, not really designed to pull the combine when the time came. He tried to nurse the John Deere along, gentle shifts, easy loads, but the transmission was going whether he babied it or not. And finally, on a Tuesday morning in late July, the tractor locked up completely in the middle of the south field. Gears frozen, engine running, but the wheels not turning. And Garrett sat there in the heat, knowing he'd just lost his primary tractor at the worst possible time. He called the shop in town, talked to a mechanic named Roy who said he could do the rebuild, but it would take 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3 if they had to order special parts, and the cost would be $1,500 now. Prices had gone up. Garrett didn't have $1,500, didn't have $500, didn't have enough to pay Roy to tow the tractor to town, and he told Roy he'd call back, hung up the phone, and stood in the kitchen trying to figure out what to do next. That's when he found the envelope, taped under the drawer in his father's desk. Thick manila envelope with Garrett written on the outside in his father's handwriting. Sealed and hidden like something that wasn't supposed to be found until exactly this moment. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, and a bundle of photographs, black and white images from the 50s and 60s showing the farm at different stages, the equipment, the fields, the gradual accumulation of land and infrastructure. And Garrett sat down and read his father's words, written maybe a year before Raymond died, written like he knew this moment was coming and wanted to explain himself while he still could. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're probably standing in that barn looking at those two tractors, wondering what the hell I was thinking. The letter started. You're probably being told to sell, probably being offered money for land that men want and think they deserve, probably feeling like you inherited a mess instead of farm. Let me tell you what you actually inherited, and why those two tractors matter more than any bank account or easy money ever could. Your granddaddy Ezra was accused of cheating to get his land, and the accusation was false, but it stuck. And when I took over this farm in 1953, I was 17 years old, and everyone in town looked at me like I was the son of a thief. I could have sold out, could have taken whatever money I could get, and started fresh somewhere else where nobody knew the story. But that would have meant admitting there was something to be ashamed of, something to run from, and I wasn't raised that way. So I decided to build something undeniable, something so clean and so successful and so obviously legitimate that nobody could ever question again. And I did it with equipment I could maintain myself, with methods I could document completely, with profits I could account for down to the last penny. Those two tractors became my proof, my witnesses, my co-conspirators in building a reputation that couldn't be attacked because everything about it was visible and honest and real. The John Deere I bought used in 1954 for $800 from a man in Missouri who was retiring, and I've rebuilt that transmission 4 times since then, replaced the clutch twice, repainted it once, maintained it like it was a member of the family, because it was. The Ford came in 1959, bought at auction for $500 from an estate sale, and I've kept it running through sheer determination and learning mechanics from library books and trial and error in that barn. Between those two machines, I worked 700 acres for less total equipment cost than most farmers spend on a single new tractor, and I've done it better than they have, more efficiently, more carefully, more successfully, because I had to, because I was working with something to prove every single day. Now you're there, and you're probably facing the same choice I faced: sell and move on, or stay and fight for something that matters more than money. The land is worth something, sure, but what it represents is worth more. And if you let men like Ed Prosser buy it piece by piece, you're admitting that they were right all along, that we never really deserved it, that your granddaddy was a cheat, and I was a fool, and you're just the last guy to figure it out. But if you stay, if you work it the way I worked it, if you prove that it can be done honestly and successfully with nothing but skill and determination, and those two tractors that everyone thinks are too old to matter, then you're carrying on something that's bigger than farming. You're carrying on a family reputation that took 2 generations to build and deserves a 3rd generation to secure it completely. I know the John Deere's transmission is probably going by now. I can feel it slipping when I work the north section, and I know you're probably reading this because something broke and you're trying to figure out what to do. Here's what you do. In the barn north wall, behind the stack of fence posts, there's a crate marked JD Parts 1968. And inside that crate is a complete transmission rebuild kit. Every gear and bearing and seal you need, bought 2 years ago when I had a good harvest and put aside for exactly this moment. And in the bottom drawer of the tool chest under the socket sets, there's an envelope with $1,800 cash, money I saved from last year's crop, money I hid for myself, so I wouldn't spend on something else, money that's there for when you need it most, which is probably right now. Rebuild that tractor yourself. Use the manual that's in the same crate. Take your time and do it right. And when it's done, you'll understand those machines the way I understood them. You'll know every bolt and every system, and you'll be able to keep them running no matter what happens because you'll have proof that you can. And when harvest comes, when you bring in a crop of equipment that everyone said was too old and too simple and too worn out, you'll have proven the same thing I spent 17 years proving, that hard work and honest methods and careful maintenance matter more than fancy equipment and easy money and all the shortcuts people want to take. I'm sorry I left without explaining this in person. Sorry we didn't talk more before you left at 18. Sorry I didn't tell you what I was building here and why it mattered. But I'm not sorry I built it, and I hope you're not sorry you stayed to finish it. The land is yours, the equipment is yours, the reputation is yours, and what you do with all of it will decide whether 2 generations of work meant something or meant nothing. I hope you choose to make it mean something. Your father, Raymond. Garrett sat at that table for an hour, reading the letter 3 times, looking at the photographs, understanding finally the full weight of what he'd inherited. And then he went out to the barn and found the crate behind the fence posts, pulled out the transmission kit and the manual, found the envelope with the cash in the tool chest exactly where his father said it would be. The money was in 20s and 50s, worn bills that smelled like oil and work, and Garrett counted it twice to make sure $1,800, enough for the rebuild in fuel and food while he did the work, enough to get through to harvest if he was careful, if he did everything himself, if he proved he could. He spent the next 3 weeks tearing down that transmission in the barn, following the manual step by step, spreading parts on clean tarps, organizing bolts and bearings in coffee cans, documenting everything with the same obsessive precision his father had used. The work was slow and careful. First time he'd ever rebuilt a transmission, making mistakes and backing up and figuring out problems by logic and patience, and refusing to quit. The Ford handled all the field work during those weeks, lighter tasks, cultivation, and weed control, keeping the remaining crops alive while the John Deere sat disassembled in the barn like a metal patient on an operating table. Neighbors drove by, slowed down to look. Some stopped to ask if Garrett needed help, if he wanted to sell equipment for parts, if he was ready to admit the farm was too much for one man with old iron and no support. And Garrett thanked him politely and kept working, hands black with grease, back aching from bending over the tractor frame, falling asleep every night with the manual open on his chest. Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever had to learn a complicated skill under pressure, with no room for error? Because everything depended on getting it right. Drop a comment about that kind of moment, because Garrett was living it every day in that barn while the crops waited and the calendar moved toward harvest, and the transmission slowly came back together piece by careful piece. By mid-August, he had it back together, new gears installed, bearings pressed in, seals replaced, everything torqued to spec according to manual, and when he filled it with fresh oil and started the engine and engaged the clutch, the transmission shifted smooth and clean, no grinding, no slipping, perfect function like it just rolled off the factory floor. He took the John Deere out to the fields that afternoon, pulled the cultivator through the south section, felt the power and precision he'd read about in his father's notes, understood for the first time why Raymond had trusted these machines so completely. They were simple enough to repair, robust enough to survive, efficient enough to profit with, and old enough that nobody else wanted them, which meant Garrett could work without competition, without envy, without attracting the kind of attention that came with success and new equipment. Harvest started in September, wheat first in the north section, what was left of it after the drought, and Garrett ran the combine behind the John Deere, cutting the dried stalks, threshing the grain, watching the wheat flow into the hopper while dust rose in cloud behind him. The yield was lower than his father's record showed for normal years, maybe 30 bushels per acre instead of 45, but it was something that was crop. It was proof that the land could still produce even in a bad year. He worked on to dusk, cutting and hauling, filling the grain truck with a Ford, driving to the elevator in town, selling load by load, watching the income accumulate in the farm account dollar by dollar. Never enough to get rich, but always enough to keep going. The Milo came next, west section, shorter than it should be, but the heads were full enough. Decent yield considering the drought, and by early October Garrett had harvested 500 acres of the 700, lost some to weather and timing and his own inexperience, but brought in enough to cover his costs and bank a little profit, enough to prove the farm was viable, that his father's methods worked, that the operation his grandfather started and his father refined could continue into a third generation. He paid his bills at the feed store and the fuel depot, settled the account at Betty's Diner, drove through town in his father's old truck with harvest dust still on his clothes, and people who'd been watching with skepticism started nodding when they saw him. That small-town acknowledgement that means you've earned something, proven something, become part of the landscape instead of just passing through. Ed Prosser stopped him outside the hardware store in November, walked up with his hands in his pockets and a different expression on his face than last time. "Heard you brought in a crop," Prosser said. "Heard you rebuilt that Deere yourself. Got it running better than it has in years." "Runs fine," Garrett said, not giving more than necessary. "Your daddy was stubborn about that land," Prosser continued, looking past Garrett at something down the street. "My Uncle Dale, he always said there was something not right about how your granddaddy acquired some of those parcels. Said it should have been investigated more thoroughly back then. I believed him. Thought maybe your family had gotten away with something, built something on a shaky foundation. But watching you this year, seeing you work that farm the way you did with equipment, that old and methods that careful, documenting everything, doing it right even when it would have been easy to cheat or cut corners, I figure if you were cheating, you'd do it differently. If your daddy was covering something up, he wouldn't have kept records that detailed. And if your granddaddy had stolen land, he probably wouldn't have passed down a farm that required that much honest work to maintain. So maybe we were wrong. Maybe the accusation was bullshit from the start. Maybe Dale Kruger was just mad his uncle sold out during the Dust Bowl and wanted to blame somebody else for his family's bad luck. He paused, kicked at the sidewalk. I'm not going to make another offer on your land. You earned it. Fair as anything I've seen. Wanted you to know that. Garrett shook his hand, didn't say much, but the moment felt significant, like a door closing on something that had been open for 40 years, like a question mark turning into a period. Other men started treating him differently after that. Not friends exactly, but colleagues. Fellow farmers who'd seen him prove something and respected the proof. And a few still held on to the old grudge about Ezra Hollins, and the land started looking petty and bitter instead of righteous. Started looking like men clinging to old stories because they had nothing better to hold on to. Winter came, cold and hard across the high plains, wind out of the north carrying sleet and ice, and Garrett spent the short days in the barn maintaining the equipment, going through every system on both tractors, replacing wear parts, adjusting tolerances, preparing for the next season. He found more of his father's notes, maintenance schedules and crop plans and observations about weather patterns, a whole education in farming written in the margins of feed store calendars and the backs of seed catalogs. And Garrett read them all, absorbed them, made them part of his own understanding of the land and the work and the legacy he'd chosen to continue. In January, he got a letter from Vernon Lassiter, county commissioner's brother, formal tone, offering to buy the whole farm, all 700 acres, for $85,000. Said it was a generous offer and Garrett should consider it seriously. Garrett wrote back on a postcard, 2 words, "No thanks," and mailed it that afternoon. Felt lighter somehow, like he'd finally closed the door on a choice that had never really been a choice, not for him, not once he understood what his father had been building and why it mattered. Spring came early in 1971, warm winds melting the snow, fields drying out enough to work by late February, and Garrett started the cycle again, plowing and planting, running the same routes his father had run, following the same patterns, but adding his own observations now, his own adjustments, his own understanding of how the land responded to timing and technique. The wheat came up strong, green shoots across 200 acres, and the milo followed in April, and by May it was clear the drought had broken, rains coming regular, soil holding moisture, crops growing with the vigor that comes from good conditions and good management, and a farmer who understands what he's doing. He hired a high school kid that summer, boy named Marcus from town, whose father farmed a small place north of the county line. Taught him how to run the Ford, how to maintain equipment, how to read soil and weather and timing, passing down the same way his father should have passed it to him if they hadn't spent 15 years not talking. Marcus was a good worker, careful and attentive, asked questions and remembered answers, and Garrett found himself explaining things the way he imagined his father would have explained them, patient and detailed, and emphasizing the why behind every technique, the reason for every method, the purpose behind the precision. The harvest that fall was exceptional, 50 bushels per acre on the wheat, solid yield on the milo, enough profit to bank real money for the first time, enough to start thinking about expansion or improvement or the long-term sustainability of the operation. But Garrett didn't buy new equipment, didn't trade in the tractors for modern models, didn't change the fundamental approach his father had established. He rebuilt the Ford's engine that winter, replaced the clutch on the John Deere, kept both machines running at peak efficiency with the same obsessive maintenance his father had practiced, understanding now that the equipment wasn't just tools. They were statements, proof of philosophy, evidence that careful work with simple machines could match or exceed careless work with expensive machines, that legacy and reputation and family honor could be built with nothing more than determination and skill in 2 old tractors that everybody thought should have been replaced decades ago. Subscribe if you want more stories about the real American farmers who built something with nothing but determination and old iron, because these stories deserve to be remembered and the men who lived them deserve to be honored. By 1975, Garrett had paid off the remaining mortgage his father had taken to buy the last parcel, owned the 700 acres free and clear, had money in the bank and a reputation in the county as a solid farmer, careful operator, man who did things right even when it was harder than cutting corners. The John Deere and the Ford were still running, still maintained with religious devotion, Still proof that his father's philosophy worked, that his grandfather's reputation was deserved, that the Hollins family had earned every acre honestly and could prove it through the work itself. Young farmers started asking Garrett for advice: how to maintain older equipment, how to run a profitable operation without massive debt, how to build something sustainable instead of something flashy. And Garrett shared what he knew, passed on his father's methods, extended the legacy beyond just his own farm into broader community. Marcus graduated high school and came to work for Garrett full-time, learned the whole operation, became the kind of careful, thoughtful farmer that Raymond would have approved of, and Garrett started thinking about succession, about passing the farm to someone who understood what it represented, who would maintain it with the same care and purpose it required. He didn't have kids of his own, had been too busy building the farm to build much of personal life. But Marcus was like a son in the ways that mattered, shared the values and the work ethic and the respect for the land and the equipment and the history that made it all meaningful. One evening in late spring of 1977, Garrett was working in the barn, tuning the John Deere's engine, when Ed Prosser pulled up in his truck, older now, still driving something too nice for farm country, but his face was different than the last time they'd talked, softer somehow, less aggressive. "Want to tell you something," Prosser said, standing in the barn doorway. "My Uncle Dale died last week, and going through his papers we found a letter written in 1948 from your granddaddy Ezra to Dale's father, offering to buy that North 80 parcel, offering a fair price, documenting the whole transaction clear as day. Dale's father sold it willingly, signed documents, took the money, and then later claimed he'd been cheated when he regretted the decision. Your granddaddy didn't cheat nobody, didn't take nothing that wasn't sold fair and square, and my family spent 40 years spreading a lie, because we couldn't admit our own man had made a bad choice and wanted to blame somebody else. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know, and because I'm sorry for what my family said about yours, for the doubt we created, for the work your father had to do to overcome a reputation he never deserved to fight against. That farm out there, those 700 acres, they're the most honestly earned land in this whole county, and everybody who knows anything knows that now." Garrett thanked him, shook his hand, watched him drive away, and then went back to work on the tractor, felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. The vindication was complete now, not just through his own work, but through documentation, through proof that went back to the beginning, through the exposure of the original lie that had started everything. His father had died not knowing that proof existed, had worked 17 years defending against an accusation that could have been disproven with a single letter if anyone had bothered to look, and that realization was both tragic and beautiful, because it meant Raymond's work had never been necessary from an evidentiary standpoint, but had been absolutely necessary from a moral and philosophical standpoint, had been the right thing to do regardless of whether the accusation was true or false. Because a man's character is proven by how he responds to challenge, not by whether the challenge was justified. Before we finish, let me know in the comments what you think matters more, being right or proving you're right, because that's the question at the heart of this whole story. That's what Raymond Hollins spent his life answering, and what Garrett learned in those fields with those two old tractors. The John Deere and the Ford are still running today, as of this telling, maintained by Marcus, who took over when Garrett retired in the late 80s, and the farm is still 712 acres, still operated with the same careful methods Raymond established, still profitable and sustainable, and proof that the old ways work if you work them right. Young farmers come by sometimes, want to see the equipment, want to hear the story, want to understand how a farm can survive and thrive with machinery that should have been replaced decades ago, and Marcus tells them what Garrett told him, which is what Raymond proved through 17 years of careful work. That equipment is just metal and fuel and timing. But a reputation is something you build with every choice you make, every corner you don't cut, every easy path you refuse to take, because the hard path leads somewhere worth going. The Hollins family name in Mineral County means something now, means honesty and skill and persistence, means a man who keeps his equipment running, and his books clean, and his words solid. And that meaning was purchased with hard work and careful maintenance, and two old tractors that became more than machines, became witnesses to a family's integrity, became proof that legacy matters and reputation matters, and sometimes the old iron is worth more than all the shiny new metal in the world because it's been tested and proven and maintained through generations of men who understood that how you do anything is how you do everything. The North 80 acres, the parcel that started all the trouble, is planted in wheat this year, same as it's been planted for 70 years. And if you stand at the fence line on a clear morning, you can see straight across to where Ed Prosser's land starts. And there's no animosity there anymore, no grudge, no old accusation hanging in the air. Just two farms side by side working the same soil under the same sky. Proof that truth eventually emerges and justice eventually arrives, and a good. Man's work eventually speaks for itself louder than any lie ever could. That's the story of how Garrett Hollins inherited 2 old tractors and 700 acres and a reputation he had earned all over again, and how he learned that his father's silence had been protecting something more valuable than land or money or equipment, had been protecting the right to do honest work in a skeptical world, the right to build something sustainable in an age of shortcuts, the right to maintain old iron not because it was cheap, but because it was trustworthy and the right, to pass down to the next generation not just acres and machinery, but a standard of conduct that made those assets meaningful. Subscribe for more stories about real farmers and real struggles and real victories in the American heartland. Drop a comment about what this story meant to you or what you would have done in Garrett's position. And share this with anyone who needs to hear about the men who build American agriculture not with fancy equipment and easy money, but with determination and skill and machines they maintained with their own hands until those machines became part of the family legacy. Part of the proof that honest work and careful management can outlast any accusation, overcome any doubt, and build something that lasts not just for a season or a career, but for generations.